In my description of why I don't actually have to read every word of Ayn Rand to have an idea of what I disagree with um, her on, I mentioned that there's books that I think people should read. Of course, I didn't mention those books, and I don't do that, and it's intentional on this channel. I don't do it for various reasons. One, I'm not here to educate people in other people's philosophy per se. I'm here describing my philosophy. And I'm not trying to add artificial weight to my philosophy by telling you where the ideas come from. I mean, I'm willing to tell you because I'm not here to take credit for ideas I didn't invent. So I'll tell you if my idea of metaphysics comes from a particular philosopher or whatnot. On the other hand, I'm not going to be pinned down to what that philosopher thought of that principle. I'm still going to be using my own interpretation. Okay, but having said that, I did claim to have books I think people should read, and somebody called me on that bluff, and so I'm going to tell you four books that I think are worth reading. Okay, the first book is Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell. This is a really important book. It's fictionalized, but you know semi autobiographical, and it's George Orwell describing living in poverty basically in Paris and then in London. And in Paris, there was no government run social network, but you could easily get a job in a Paris restaurant. Maybe get a corner of the restaurant to sleep in near a boiler or something. And then in London, where they did have a social services system, but they really kept people. This is where the word tramp came from, because they put the shelters something like a day's walk, and you could stay only a day, something like this. And maybe you could stay 2 days. I think it was just a day. So basically, you go to the shelter, and then you have to spend all the next day walking to the next shelter, and you just be tramping around London, and you didn't really have a chance to get on your 2 feet or get out of the system. So it was a more compassionate system, but it trapped you more, so it was a really more compassionate. George Orwell is a very interesting man. He wrote for a socialist newspaper, considered himself um, a socialist, and yet he did not buy any of that dogma. Another good thing to read by George Orwell is an essay you can find online uh, about the use of the English language in politics. I highly recommend that and all George Orwell for understanding how politics really works in the Western world. A second book I would recommend is The Myth of Sisyphus by Camus. The Myth of Sisyphus, of course, is about Sisyphus, who in Hades was condemned to pushing a boulder up a hill only to see it roll down and then have to push it back up and see it roll down, and he was doing this for eternity. Camus uses this as a metaphor for our lives, in a world without a clear objective reality or basis, without a metaphysics. We're challenged with, well, what is the meaning of life, and isn't it ultimately meaningless? And so Camus uses this metaphor of Sisyphus uh, as a metaphor for our lives, that this is basically what we're doing. We just keep doing things, we have to do them again, and what's the point? But he calls that absurdity, because life is basically absurd. It's not just that sometimes ironic, strange things happen. That's the nature of life. But in that, he finds reason to live. He says, well, the secret is that you have to enjoy pushing the boulder up the hill, and you have to enjoy watching it roll down again. That makes a lot of sense to me, because I grew up in the country enough that I know that pushing big rocks down hills is actually very fun. It's very fun to watch that. And so I can picture that. I see the futility of Sisyphus having to do this over and over again. But on the other hand, I see that it's enjoyable watching the rock roll down the hill. And given nothing else to do, it would be worth pushing the boulder back up the hill to watch it roll down again. And at any rate, Camus says whether we can pull it off or not might be another question, but enjoying that process is where the enjoyment of life comes, not from there being an ultimate meaning, such as trying to get the boulder to stay at the top of the hill, or any permanent accomplishment. So without permanent accomplishments, we enjoy the interaction with our environment, and that is where our personal enjoyment as living beings will come from. The third book I would say to read is Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche's not the kind of philosopher that you just agree with his worldview. He never wrapped it up like that. It's too hard to characterize him. So you can talk about Nietzsche and get some interesting topics, or you can grab some tools from Nietzsche. Sometimes he presented tools like his view of metaphysics or whatnot. And you could adopt that. You can adopt certain arguments. But as far as getting a whole worldview, it's not that kind of philosophy. But it's good. He's good reading. It's very enlightening reading. But and you should read it with a grain of salt and your own ideas. I suggest Beyond Good and Evil over other books which are just as good or even better, because I decided to suggest that one because it has an argument about Descartes' cogito. I think, therefore I am. Descartes was trying to doubt everything he could and find out, well, where will I stop being able to doubt? Where will I get stuck and unable really to doubt anymore? And that's where he stopped. I think, therefore I am. And in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche breaks that down. He shows that there's still more assumptions that could be doubted in there. For example, that I am the one thinking. I could be the process of thought. And now those of us that are materialists and think that the brain has activity and that it results in us having an identity, it results in us having thoughts, it results in I. So we're the result of thinking. And when we die, that's why we stop thinking. So saying I think is actually an assertion that Descartes could not really prove. And he might as well, instead of saying I think, therefore I am, just have said the word I. Because the word I contains the necessary assumptions to say that I am. Nietzsche goes on more just into this idea of us assuming that we're the cause of things. And I think it's a good example of how Nietzsche can help us analyze problems without telling us actually what our conclusions can be. He can show that there are ways to dig deeper into ideas that a mind as great as Descartes could get stuck on. The final book is Philosophy in the Flesh by George Lakoff. And George Lakoff is he's a linguist. He's a cognitive scientist. Cognitive science is a collaboration among all sorts of disciplines that have to do with thinking. Psychology and philosophy and linguistics is very involved, but also so are neurophysicists, and anybody that really is studying the mind is eligible to be in this kind of collaboration. It's based on the idea of an embodied mind, that our thinking really does come from this mind, this body, and what it has to do in a real world. So it doesn't believe these things like a priori truths or that the law of non-contradiction or anything else are absolute or self-evident. Philosophy in the Flesh goes through philosophy for a survey of the metaphors used in philosophy, because this is one thing that this area of cognitive science has now concluded, basically. Like all good conclusions, it's really just opening a can of worms to start more study. But insofar as it's a conclusion, the conclusion is that humans think in metaphors, and ultimately all the metaphors come down to sense and motor metaphors, metaphors that have to do with our perceptions, which basically are space and time metaphors. And I put this book last because this is really where we are right now. We need to think of philosophy in terms of a materialist world where the brain is a body, there is no dualism, there is no spirit that's separate. Whatever the spirit is, it would be a material thing. Whatever the will is, it's a material thing. It comes from cognition, from having a actual physical brain that is doing this thinking. So those are 4 books that I think will do really well in terms of understanding philosophy, from the basic abstract fundamentals all the way up to the strange world of fallacies known as politics.